Good day. Today is Friday, 3rd January 2025, and I'm going to focus much of today's program on the conflict in Ukraine, as I often do. And before I discuss the political news, the political information, just to say that I'm also going to firstly look at the military situation, though I'm going to try to do it more briefly than usual. I say that because every day now, the pace of the Russian advance in southwestern Donbass appears to accelerate. We have more news of a growing Russian breakthrough in the Oskol and Zherebets river lines, and it's increasingly looking as if the battle for Kursk region is becoming now the battle for the town of Sudzha, which the Ukrainians appear to be reinforcing. But let's focus firstly on what's going on in southwestern Donbass. We've heard less about the situation around Velikaya Novosilka over the last couple of days, but the likelihood is that the Russian ring on this small town has tightened. There's apparently been many Ukrainian counterattacks. None of these, however, seem to have made any significant progress. At least I've heard no reports that they have. And anyway, I suspect that at some point over the next couple of days, the Russians will launch a storming operation in Velikaya Novosilka, and this small town, in turn, will fall. In the area of the town of Kurakovo, now firmly under Russian control, as confirmed by Russian and Ukrainian commentators, the Russians are now pushing westwards. They've captured the village of Shevchenko. They have west of Selidovo. They're pushing on, capturing more villages and small towns in this same area. Apparently, the fields between the towns, between these villages, are quite big, which means that Russian forces have sufficient room for maneuver, and that the overstretched Ukrainian forces are unable to to establish coherent defences between the villages. The result is that one village is falling after another. There have been reports of further advances over the course of the day, and with every step that the Russians move further westwards towards the Dnieper River and towards Dnipro region, the Russians also work towards outflanking this last remaining Ukrainian fortified area around Urakli, Andreevka, Rozlev and Konstantinopol, a cluster of villages where the Ukrainians apparently built various fortifications at some undisclosed date in the past, and which appears to be the place where they intend to make their last stand in this area. Beyond these fortified positions, as I understand it, there are open fields and small villages extending all the way to the Dnieper, and no significant fortifications to speak of at all. So this is perhaps the area of the fastest Ukrainian advance, but in some fastest Russian advance, but perhaps in some ways for the Ukrainians the most dangerous situation now is around the city of Pokrovsk itself. It seems that the Russians, having captured the village of Pishanye, have also probably captured the village of Vovkovye, which lies to the west of Pishanye, and there are now reports that the Russians have reached and are preparing to storm the village of Kotlino, which lies to the southwest of Pokrovsk, well to the west of Pokrovsk. Now, if Kotlino is captured by the Russians, which at some point presumably it will be, that will mean that the Russians have cut the road, the TO406 road, which is one of the roads that connects Pokrovsk to the city of Dnipro, and along which supplies to Pokrovsk come. And it will also mean that a major railway line that also passes through Kotlino into Pokrovsk, and which is also used by the Ukrainians to send supplies to Pokrovsk, that railway line will have been cut as well. Moreover, there appear to be no significant villages or inhabited places north of Kotlino, and the last remaining road to the west, which is the E50 road, which also leads ultimately to the Dnieper River. It veers in and eventually takes us also through Pavlograd to Dnipro as well. So all of these places, Kotlino, Udachne, which is located southwest of Kotlino, all of these places apparently are now Uspenivka, which is another village in this area. All of these villages are now under attack by the Russians. A whole cluster of villages to the southwest of Pokrovsk. And as I discussed, I think it was in yesterday's video, the Russians have now captured the village of Vozdvizhenka, which has brought them close to the TO504 road leading from Pokrovsk through Mirnograd eastwards on to Konstantinovka, the city south of Kramatorsk. And of course, if the Russians are able to cut the TO504 road and advance north of this road and also capture the other villages located to the west of Mirnograd on this road, Novoekonomichne, Mykolaievka, Mirnie, Malinivka, that also puts them in a good position to start cutting the road and railway lines leading into Pokrovsk from the north. As I discussed in my program yesterday, Pokrovsk is being steadily encircled, and this is happening at rapid speed. Moreover, there is good reason to think that the situation of the Ukrainian troops in this whole area, Pokrovsk, west of Selidovo in the Kurakovo area, is becoming increasingly bad. Now, there have been many reports over the last couple of days about mass desertions of Ukrainian troops in this area. Specifically, there have been claims that one particular brigade that was trained in France has lost 1,700 men, which would presumably be around half the brigade's strength, through mass desertion. Now, this seemed so extraordinary that I have hesitated to report this up to this time, but it has now been confirmed, or at least it has now been reported as well by Yuri Butuzov, who is of course a Ukrainian commentator, good Ukrainian commentator, fervidly pro-Ukrainian, by the way, but in terms of his reporting, he's one of the most interesting people to follow. Anyway, he is now also talking about this mass desertion of troops as part of this French-trained brigade. A supposedly elite brigade, recently trained in France, deployed apparently for the first time to the battlefields, and within days of its deployment, first deployment, the entire brigade has essentially collapsed. Now, if this is becoming a general problem across the Ukrainian military, which some reports suggest it is, then obviously the entire Ukrainian military is in very serious trouble. But put that aside, even the collapse of a single brigade in the Pokrovsk area would be a serious matter. But every indication suggests that the state and mood of Ukrainian troops in the entire Pokrovsk area and also west of Selidovo and in the Kurakovo pocket, the area of the Andreevka, Urakli, Konstantinopol, Rozlev fortified area, that the condition, the mood of the Ukrainian troops in this area is now extremely bad. And, well, there's also been reports from other places. I'm not going to go into the same detail, but supposedly the Russians now control more than 90% of Toretsk. The Ukrainians clinging on to some buildings, some residential buildings on the northern outskirts of Toretsk. It's been suggested that they're doing that in order to continue to claim that they control Toretsk at the time when the new president, Donald Trump, takes office in January. And there's also further reports that there's a deepening crisis of the Ukrainians in Chasiv Yar as well. There's been some claims of more Ukrainian counterattacks in that area. I'm deeply skeptical about these reports. On the contrary, the trend of the fighting in Chasiv Yar seems to be moving steadily in the Russians' favour. And there's reports that the Russians have now taken control of another railway station in the Chasiv Yar area. Chasiv Yar being an important railway junction, and I've discussed in previous programs the importance of the railways in this particular war. So, a deteriorating military situation. There was apparently another significant Russian missile strike across Ukraine yesterday. It wasn't one of the biggest, but it is being reported on by the Russian Defense Ministry and by the TASS news agency. The story about these Russian missile strikes is that they're now becoming routine. Now, this darkening picture on the battlefronts was perhaps for the first time fully reflected by Vladimir Zelensky himself in an interview he appears to have given to Ukrainian television. Now, the interview, as is so often the case with Zelensky, was a confusing mess, at least so far as I was concerned. Now, he said all kinds of things, not all of them very consistent with each other. He spoke about how the Russians are refusing to negotiate, which is most remarkable when the person who has, in fact, enacted a decree which prohibits Ukraine from engaging in negotiations is none other than Zelensky himself. So I'm not sure where that claim that the Russians are refusing to negotiate comes from, but anyway, that is what Zelensky says. He still, in places over the course of this interview, appears to talk a continued narrative of victory, or at least of Ukraine holding out. He says that he expects that the Ukrainians will be able, in some way, to stabilize the front lines in January. But he spoke also about how the Ukrainian troops on the front lines are tired, how they're exhausted, how they're demoralized, how the situation is very difficult for them. He acknowledged more than he has done at any point before that his army is in serious trouble and that it is finding it more and more difficult to hold on to its positions across the battlefront. This being, of course, Zelensky, he's not I think, saying any of these things with any real serious negotiation intention rather, to begin any serious talks or negotiations with the Russians. What he's actually, of course, doing is preparing the ground for his decree extending the age of conscription to boys of 18. Apparently, that is now has now been presented to the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, and I expect that it will be enacted at some point within the next couple of days or weeks, probably before Donald Trump is inaugurated. So that, I think, is the purpose of Zelensky's interview, to prepare the Ukrainian people for this decision. I don't think it is intended to tell them that the war is in effect lost, but those of us who are not persuaded that reducing the age of conscription is going to change the dynamics on the battlefield. I don't know anybody who thinks it can. Conscripting large numbers of 18, 19 and 20-year-olds. When is Ukraine going to train them? How extensively can they be trained? How can they be organized for battle? And are they anyway even willing to fight? Anyway, put all these questions aside. None of this is going to change the dynamic of the battle. It might prolong Ukraine's death agony by a few more months at the costs of tens of thousands of young lives. But anyway, that, I think, is what Zelensky is intending to do. And one of his aides, I believe it is Mikhailo Podolyak, has now come out again and has basically trashed the whole idea of negotiations. He says that there's no real sign that the Russians are interested in negotiations. All talk of negotiations is empty talk. In effect, what Ukraine must continue to do is continue to fight. By the way, on this front, there is a kind of identity between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russian ambassador to the UN Security Council, Vasily Nebenzia, has given an interview to Russia 24 television on today, and he has also cast cold water on the theory that there's going to be negotiations, serious negotiations, between the US and Russia anytime soon to try to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end. And these are his words. These are some unformalized, unclear signals about the readiness for something. We frequently hear the word conflict freezing. Last time it was on December 19th that President Putin outlined clearly and expressly the conditions on which we are ready to talk, not about freezing, but about completing the conflict, given the observance of our legitimate security interests. However, there is nothing in signals from the new American administration yet that can provide evidence that there is something of interest for us. And about the Ukrainians, he said the Ukrainian side has also indicated signals about some accords which cannot be perceived seriously. The question is what the engagement line will look like when Zelensky, let us presume, finally shows his desire to sit down to a negotiating table. The further it is, the worse the conditions will be for him. He was told about that a long time ago, so it is up to him to decide. That was from Nebenzia. We see that according to his latest interview, Zelensky for the moment continues to resist the logic of what the Russians are saying. With every day that the Russian army continues to advance westwards, Ukraine's position deteriorates, the Ukrainian army deteriorates, the position of the Russians gets stronger on the battlefield, and with every westward advance, the prospect grows that the Russians will raise their demands. And of course, some days ago, Dmitry Medvedev was talking about the fact that Russia should prepare for more annexations of Ukrainian territory over and above the 4 regions. Putin, of course, has not said anything of that kind himself. But anyway, that's what Medvedev said. And one of the things I've noticed about this war is that when Medvedev says something, outrageous as it can often seem, some months later, perhaps a year later, it begins to become Russian policy. Anyway, there it is. That's the Ukrainians. For the moment, they are not negotiating, despite the fact that the Russians continue advancing. And for the moment, the administration, the new Trump administration, is not putting forward proposals that the Russians consider that they can work with. They see it all as very nebulous and very uncertain. They believe that the Trump administration, they clearly believe that the Trump administration does not have a proper understanding of the realities of the situation on the battlefronts. Anyway, there has been another report by Russia's intelligence agency, the SVR, which came out on Friday, on Friday. And it reads as follows. The information available to the SVR, that's Russia's premier intelligence service, suggests that Western political elites note the Ukrainian army's reduced capability to withstand the thrust by the Russian armed forces. It is not ruled out that the Ukrainian army's defenses may collapse soon. And the SVR report goes on to say, the outgoing administration of US President Biden seeks to avoid this scenario, making emphasis on the deliveries of more sophisticated weapons, including longer-range missiles. However, the White House admits that supplying the Ukrainian army with material only is insufficient for stabilizing the front lines. The Ukrainian authorities have already prepared a decision to lower the mobilization age to 18 and will adopt it shortly. Washington demanded recently that Zelensky lower the mobilization call-up age to 18 years. Kiev has prepared the corresponding decision and will adopt it shortly. Meanwhile, Eastern European countries bordering Ukraine are already quietly preparing for receiving new waves of Ukrainian refugees who this time will be fleeing not from the imaginary threat from Russia. Well, the Russians are advancing, so the threat might not be quite so imaginary as the SVR says. But anyway, not from an imaginary threat from Russia, but from a real danger of getting a one-way ticket to the front line. It is believed that residents of Kiev-controlled territories would be ready for everything to get out of the hands of the Ukrainian ruling regime that has sold off their lives to their masters on the other side of the ocean for a penny. The West is aware that the conflict is of an existential nature for Russia, and it will not back down. It has been clear from the very start that Kiev's refusal to negotiate drives Ukrainians into slaughter, and Zelensky persistently follows the path of destroying the people of Ukraine. Well, that was the SVR. Now, I am going to suggest that this statement by the SVR that came out today might have been partly inspired by a very interesting article that has appeared in Washington, D.C., in The Hill to be precise, one of the most interesting newspaper magazines on political matters. In fact, an absolutely essential read if you're interested in political matters in the United States. Anyway, a very interesting article in The Hill, which has been published, which was published just before the new year, and which was authored by an analyst called James Durso, who writes extensively for publications like The Hill and other similarly weighty publications in the United States. And James Durso, I should say, is a former naval officer. He has been described to me as a neocon. I have to take some issue with that. I've been reading various articles and things that he has written at various places. On the contrary, he seems to me to have been a consistent critic of the whole project of eastward expansion of NATO. He was one of those people who appears to have predicted that this project of expanding NATO eastwards would provoke a war in Ukraine. And he also is one of these people who is very critical of the whole American policy, the whole American role, the role followed by the current administration of supporting the continuation of the war in Ukraine. Anyway, this article, which The Hill published on, as I said, New Year's Eve, is entitled "Hold Ukraine Accountable for Corruption, Misspent Aid." And the article goes into great detail about the corruption in Ukraine, which I am not going to return to because, to say it straightforwardly, I don't myself feel that on this specific question of Ukrainian corruption, which has been discussed extensively, both on this channel and by us on the Duran and by many, many others, the article says anything that is particularly new. But midway through the article, this bombshell is dropped. In April 2024, the leadership of Ukraine's military intelligence participated in a series of roundtable discussions at Washington think tanks and policy makers. A former American diplomat familiar with the visit told this author, in other words, Mr. Durso himself, quote, "They expressed their reservations about continuing full-scale conventional warfare. They were concerned that Ukraine had lost momentum and would be overwhelmed. They advocated instead for increased asymmetric warfare inside Russia to gain an upper hand in negotiations to end the war." End quote. The result of this engagement was that the chief of military intelligence, Kirill Budanov, was muzzled by Zelensky's team in a series of media attacks in pro-government websites. His key deputies were fired without his consent, weakening his agency. All very interesting. So, what does this tell us? It tells us that in April 2024, shortly after the fall of Avdiivka in February and the fall of Ocheretino in March, Budanov, I presume that is who is meant by the leadership of Ukraine's military intelligence, came to Washington with his various aides and participated in a series of roundtable discussions. And these involved Washington think tanks and policy makers. Now, I heard nothing at all about these discussions at the time, and I assume that the discussions took place in private. And the reference to think tanks and policy makers suggests to me that members of the administration, senior members of the administration, probably the intelligence community, probably people from the Department of Defense, and presumably the various think tanks, and of course the think tanks in Washington are very much a part of the permanent government of the United States. They were all involved. So this was a series of discussions about the state of the war happening directly after a series of important events. The defeat in 2023 of Ukraine's summer counteroffensive, the failure of the Krinky operation, the fall of Avdiivka, the capture by the Russians of Ocheretino, and the start of the Great Russian Offensive westwards, and by the way, shortly after, of the Russian advance on Toretsk. And around the same time, there were, as I remember, rumors about a pending Russian offensive in Kharkiv region. All of this was going on in April. And Budanov and his people briefed the people in Washington that Ukraine was going to lose the war. Because this is how I understand these words. They expressed their reservations about continuing full-scale conventional warfare. They were concerned that Ukraine had lost momentum and would be overwhelmed. They advocated instead for increased asymmetric warfare inside Russia to gain an upper hand in negotiations to end the war. So Kirill Budanov and his people said the Russians are too strong. They are going to win. We are going to lose the war. And that was disclosed by Ukrainian military intelligence, by Budanov and his people, to the Americans in April. Now, April is a very interesting month. It was in April that President Biden signed off on the $61 billion appropriation, which had just been voted through by Congress and which included a significant allocation. I think it was about $20 billion for Ukraine. It was also in April that the United States first began its debate in connection with the Kharkiv offensive of authorizing missile strikes using ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia. As I recently discussed, an article in the New York Times has now disclosed that it was at around this time that the United States government, that the Biden administration, actually made the decision to authorize missile strikes on Russia, though they postponed implementation of that decision until after the November election. They also, at about this time, pressed forward with the peace conference, so-called, in Switzerland. And, of course, there was also a NATO summit meeting at the end of June. So all of this was going on at about this time. And it's likely that the reference to increased asymmetric warfare inside Russia to gain an upper hand in negotiations to end the war is an elliptical reference to the Kursk operation, which I and many others, Scott at Calibrated being another one, by the way, believe was intended to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant in order to try to force the Russians into some kind of compromise. That, after all, seems to me to conform closely with the concept of asymmetric warfare to gain an upper hand in negotiations. Just saying. It's also likely that it was about this time also that a further green light was given to the campaign of sabotage and assassinations inside Russia, which we have seen, including the recent assassination, of course, of General Kirillov. But the key point is that in April, the Biden administration, the American government, was briefed by Ukrainian military intelligence that the war was effectively lost. Ukraine could not win a conventional war against the Russian army. If it continued fighting, there was an increased prospect of it being eventually overwhelmed. And yet, the Biden administration persisted. It didn't take immediate action to end the war. It's completely unclear to me whether it briefed Congress, which had, of course, just voted through this enormous appropriation. By the way, just before the election, it actually approached Congress to see whether Congress might be prepared to grant a further appropriation to keep the war in Ukraine going. And instead, it went for escalation. It went forward with the idea of launching missile strikes against Russia. It also went forward with the plan, or at least looks like it gave some kind of tacit agreement to the plan, might have been more than tacit, for this operation in Kursk region and all kinds of other things about which we know a great deal less. So all of this appears to have happened in April. And of course, the war has gone on. None of the things that were decided in April have worked. Kursk has proved a disaster. The Swiss Peace Conference was a flop. The missile strikes on Russia, which began in November, have failed to achieve anything of any military significance. All that they've done is highlighted how strong the Russian air defense system is and how many missiles, 500 ATACMS missiles, the Biden administration has wasted on this enterprise. And they've also provided the Russians with a perfect opportunity to display the capabilities of their new Oreshnik missile system. Here again, we get a brief glimpse behind the curtain, and we can see how strange and how, frankly, dishonest the approach to this war of the Biden administration has consistently been. Back in April, they were talking about a stalemate in the war. Ukrainian military intelligence had actually briefed them that, on the contrary, the war was being lost. Well, there we are. So it's been known by the Biden people since April that things were going wrong. It's been presumably fairly well known by quite a few people in Washington that the war was going wrong. I do wonder, by the way, whether anybody briefed General Kellogg and Fred Feitz about this, because as it turns out, they were penning a report at around this very same time about possible negotiations with the Russians, which were also predicated on the idea that there would be some kind of a stalemate in the war, which we now know wasn't the case. And needless to say, it seems that Donald Trump, who already by April was the certain candidate of the Republican Party going forward into the election, it seems almost certain that he was not briefed about this information either. Well, all of this may seem historic, but it again seems to me incredible that decisions, the way in which decisions have been taken in Washington over the course of this administration. The United States has a big responsibility for Ukraine. It insisted that Ukraine had a right to join NATO. It refused to bargain about this issue with the Russians. I've discussed this question of Ukraine's right to join NATO in many places. I've said many times that Ukraine has a right to apply to join NATO. NATO and the United States have no obligation to agree to that application. On the contrary, if they believe that by doing so they would threaten peace in Europe and indeed the existence of Ukraine itself, then they have at the very least a moral obligation, and arguably a legal one, to refuse to consent to that application. Given that they had already given numerous promises to the Russians in the early 1990s that eastward expansion of NATO would not take place, it seems to me that it was even more incumbent upon them to refuse an application from Ukraine to join NATO, which could only create the kind of disaster that we see today. The United States also actively supported Ukraine's sabotage of the Minsk agreement, which offered a pathway towards achieving domestic peace in Ukraine. And as has been confirmed by people like General Kuyak and Michael Schulenberg in a huge report that they did, and which has been acknowledged by many others, the United States was instrumental in sabotaging the draft peace agreement agreed by Ukraine and Russia in Istanbul in April 2022. The United States, the Western allies, in other words, did exactly what Professor Mearsheimer did. They led Ukraine step by step along the primrose path towards its own destruction. So given this record, in a situation where Ukrainian military intelligence is telling the United States, and presumably by extension some of the United States' core partners, Britain being one, that the war in Ukraine was being lost, that Ukraine could not continue full-scale conventional warfare. To go back to the article, they, i.e. Ukrainian military intelligence, expressed their reservations about continuing full-scale conventional warfare. In other words, in the current war, Ukraine is going to lose. Given that this is so, given the way in which the United States has led Ukraine on, it was incumbent upon the US, or so it seems to me, to try in the spring and summer of last year to bring the war to an end. And of course that didn't happen. The reasons are not difficult to see. Firstly, the administration itself is deeply emotionally invested in Project Ukraine, as is, by the way, the president himself. The administration still hopes that some kind of miracle will be achieved and the situation will be transformed, and they did so back in April 2022, which is why they endorsed this utterly reckless proposal from the Ukrainians that Ukraine engage in asymmetric warfare inside Russia, a campaign of sabotage and assassination, and an almost certain attempt to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant. Unbelievably reckless steps which any responsible US government should have vetoed then and there. That's the first thing. They are heavily invested in this project. They can't bring themselves to accept that their entire grandiose strategy of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia, provoking a political crisis in Moscow, engineering regime change there, that was going to fail, and that the moment had come to call a stop. But of course there was another very simple, very straightforward political factor at play as well, which is that in April, President Biden was still hoping to be re-elected President of the United States. And coming forward and taking serious steps to bring the war to an end would have been an admission of failure, and quite plausibly would have damaged his prospects of re-election. And that calculus continued to apply even after the president himself stood down as a candidate in the election and was replaced by his vice president, Kamala Harris. So they could not, for that very simple political reason, either acknowledge what Ukrainian military intelligence was saying. But of course it gets worse, because after the election was out of the way, despite the fact that all that we have seen play out since that meeting in April has been confirmed by actual events on the battlefronts, even as the Russian advance across Ukraine has accelerated, even as the Russians are now starting to approach the Dnieper and are getting through the defences. Even as all of that has happened, the administration continues to resist call for talks. It continues to arm Ukraine. It continues to send more billions of dollars, spend more billions of dollars of US taxpayers' money on the war, a war that it must by now know is lost, and which it was told back in April was effectively lost. It has authorized missile strikes deep inside Russia, despite concerns within the US intelligence community and by the Pentagon about the risks of doing all of that. And of course it continues to look for all sorts of ways to intensify the sanctions pressure on Russia. All of this continues despite the fact that the political calculus that perhaps played a role in maintaining the administration's support for Ukraine before the election now no longer applies, now that the election itself has been lost. Well, there we are. Of course, it's not difficult to understand again the reason for all of this, because the war is indeed lost. But the hope is that the damage, the political damage, will not be borne by the administration itself. It will be borne by the new president, by Donald Trump and his team. So what is now happening is that steps are being taken to prolong a war which the administration was told back in April was going to be lost, by bullying the Ukrainians into lowering the conscription age to release more cannon fodder to be killed on the battle lines, by sending more US arms to Ukraine, by hunting in Syria for more weapons also to send to Ukraine. so that when the collapse comes, it will be the Trump administration, not the current administration, that is blamed. And in the meantime, steps are taken, like launching missile strikes against Russia. The current block on gas supplies across Ukraine from Russia to Europe, the likely oil sanctions, which I suspect we're going to see over the course of the next couple of days. All of that is also being taken despite its entirely predictable inflationary consequences. Again, because, well, let's make life as difficult for the future administration as possible. I read an article, by the way, a couple of days ago about the massive overspending by the current administration in the last few weeks. Apparently, it's already gone, or it's intending to go through 30% of the funding allocated for fiscal 2025. It's leaving Donald Trump with a budget shortfall to cover spending for the remainder of the year 2025 until next autumn. And again, it looks as if part of the intention is to create a situation where either the administration goes for more spending, possibly increasing inflation even further, widening the US deficit, creating more problems in the economy, piling on more debt, all of that. It either does that or it has to engage in some deeply unpopular budget cuts, which might not be popular at all with the Trump administration's electoral constituencies. So all of this intended to make the life of the new administration as difficult as possible. And all of this partly intended to undermine the prospect of talks, which, as we see, Zelensky and the Europeans are not keen on anyway, despite the advice from Ukraine's own military intelligence back in April that the war was effectively lost. Now, Mr. D'Urso in The Hill also has now explained why Budanov found himself in such political difficulties earlier this year. There was an open campaign in the media orchestrated by Zelensky's chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, to get him sacked. That hasn't quite happened. He's still in place, but Budanov's star certainly seems to have dimmed, and it's definitely the case that he's gone very quiet. And it now looks as if Zelensky and his people were not happy with the admission from Budanov, the one that he gave to the Americans back in April, that in military terms the war was lost. Because, of course, Zelensky's entire platform, his entire project over the last few months, going all the way back to his announcement of his so-called victory plan, was about how the war was still winnable. All that the United States needed to do was provide Tomahawk missiles, NATO guarantees, all that kind of thing, and Ukraine would emerge triumphant. So obviously, they didn't take kindly to Budanov spoiling that picture, and as a result, they threatened to sack him, and they've basically put the dampeners on him, which is why we hear about him so much less. Now, this brings me to the main underlying point that I want to make in this program, which brings us back to the topic of negotiations between Donald Trump and his team and the Russians about finding some route back towards ending the war in Ukraine. The point I have made in program after program is that the war in Ukraine is lost. The Biden administration's great gamble, because that's what it was. They may not have understood the fact at the time in February 2022 when they embarked on the policy of imposing massive sanctions on the Russians and going after the Russians in every possible way they could, and in shipping vast numbers of arms, weapons to the Russians. Anyway, the great gamble that the Biden administration made in February 2022 has been lost. The Russians clearly are not going to lose the war in Ukraine. Their economy, despite various predictions, which I'll come to shortly, is not about to collapse. There has to be at some point an acknowledgement of this fact, difficult though it still seems to be for some people. And as for the war itself, despite all the hundreds of billions of dollars of aid that the United States and other Western countries have sent to Ukraine, well, we see the catastrophic military situation that Ukraine is currently facing. Now, yesterday, Alex Christoforou and I did a program, a live stream with Scott of Calibrated, who follows the course of the war in minute detail, and he made this very point, that Ukraine's military is collapsing, it is breaking down. Zelensky himself is now admitting as much, that the Russians are almost through the last great fortified lines that Ukraine constructed after the 2014 fighting, that Ukrainian military brigades are exhausted and tired. Even Zelensky himself is admitting this. And the likelihood is that once the Russians break through these defensive lines, especially if they start continue to move west towards the Dnieper, this process of collapse, which started to really assert itself from midsummer, is going to start to accelerate even faster than we have seen up to now. And, well, we can now see that the Ukrainians themselves, or at least some Ukrainians, Ukraine's military intelligence agency, was starting to report as far back as April that the war in itself, in effect, is now lost. It cannot be won through fully conventional means. They came up with this idea of using asymmetric means. The missile strikes on Russia have failed to produce any results. The assassinations have hardened attitudes in Moscow, and the Kursk operation to capture the nuclear power plant, as I believe, has ended in a complete debacle. So if the Ukrainians themselves, way back in April, were starting to realize that the war is lost, then there is no point in continuing with the fiction that it can be won or that it can be brought to a standstill. And once more, let me repeat my point. If Donald Trump really does want to extricate the United States from this mess, if he wants to try and bring this war to an early conclusion, or to as early a conclusion as possible, he needs to work with that understanding. He needs to grasp that the Russians are winning the war, and that on the present trajectory, which cannot be reversed, at some point they are going to win the war. And his entire negotiating strategy needs to be constructed around this fact. He can't go into a negotiation assuming that his cards are stronger than they really are. If he does, he will find that the Russians reject whatever proposal he makes, and that he and the United States will find themselves in a position of owning a debacle. Now, here I'm going to make a point which I rarely do make, but perhaps in Trump's case I need to make, which is that he does need to start thinking also not just about America's self-interests, but ultimately his own. Just as he needs to start to distance the United States from a debacle, he also needs to make sure that when the debacle does happen, as it eventually will, he is not brought down by it when, as he correctly says, he had no role in creating it in the first place. So all of that speaks of taking realistic steps. Now, around a year ago, there was this very powerful article that appeared in the American media decrying what was called magical thinking, the idea that the Ukrainians could prevail in their 2023 summer offensive against entrenched Russian defenses, the powerful fortified lines that the Russians had created against a Russian army that was extremely experienced and had become stronger. That article, its message has never been properly internalized in the West. So much so that, as I discussed in my program yesterday, we've had another article from Stephen Wertheim, who is again warning, this time the Europeans, against magical thinking. This time the magical thinking in question being that the United States will always be there to fight for them, despite the fact that it is overextended superpower with many more commitments to take on, and that it needs to find some sort of way out of the conflict in Ukraine. So within the space of a single year, we've had, as far as I can see, 2 articles that warn against magical thinking, slightly different, on some slightly different issues, but nonetheless deeply connected ones. Now, I say that because there continues to be a great deal of magical thinking still about. To give an example, recently I read in the Financial Times a short piece in the Financial Times discussing predictions for 2025. And the predictions for 2025 was that the United States, that Donald Trump would have to escalate in Ukraine in order to force the Russians to the negotiating table. That this is the sort of thing that needed to be done in order to achieve positive outcomes in terms of the negotiations in Ukraine. I'll read the piece. It's fairly short. Will there be a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia? Yes, but the US president will have to threaten tougher sanctions and escalate support to Kiev to persuade Moscow to engage seriously in talks. US allies will convince Trump not to take NATO membership for Ukraine off the table, at least at the outset. And Ukraine's Vladimir Zelensky will agree to de facto but not de jure Russian control of land it currently occupies, with some land swaps in return for European security guarantees with US support, while Ukraine's NATO accession is ultimately put on ice. Vladimir Putin will calculate that European resolve will eventually falter. So, this is essentially a call for Trump to escalate the war, to escalate with tougher sanctions and more military support for Ukraine, to, in other words, continue to do that which the Biden administration has been doing for the last 3 years, just to go on doing more of it. And, well, we're getting articles, one today in the Daily Telegraph by Ambrose Evans Pritchard, one of a series now, which says all you need to do is tighten on sanctions even more, particularly energy exports. We've seen the first moves. We've seen the cut-off of gas supplies from Russia to Europe via Ukraine. And the Biden administration is talking about cutting off oil supplies or doing things with oil supplies, cutting Russia's access to oil revenues. And Ambrose Evans Pritchard says this will do the trick. That the Russian economy is running hot, inflation is high. He claims that the annualized rate of inflation is closer to 30%. I don't quite know how he works that one out, by the way, but anyway, that's what he's saying. He says that the inflation rate in Russia is out of control, that businesses all over the country are going bankrupt, that there's that the budget situation is terrible because companies in the military-industrial complex are taking out loans, which is really covert support by Russian banks, running down Russian citizens' savings in order to sustain the Russian war economy. Things of this kind, all of which, well, all I will say about it, if you do what I do, which is listen or read discussions on economic questions in the Russian media, or read what Russian officials, people like Siluanov, Nabulina, the central bank chair, people like that are saying, well, these articles by people like Ambrose Evans Pritchard, they inhabit a completely different world of facts from the ones that I am seeing. So, more arms supplies, more sanctions, only this time package it, go on doing the same thing, but pretend you're doing it for some different purpose, that this time it's different in some way, because you're not seeking outright victory anymore. You want a negotiation which will give you, in effect, exactly what you always wanted. The Russians will be left in de facto control of Ukrainian territory, but of course no one will recognize it. Ukraine's NATO's membership will be put on ice, which of course means that it can be activated or reactivated at any time. The Europeans, with US support, in other words, with a US backstop, will give Ukraine security guarantees, and the Americans will give the Europeans security guarantees. All of the things that the Russians said were unacceptable, you're going to get out of this peace deal when you impose more sanctions against the Russians and if you step up more military supplies to Ukraine. Now, straightforwardly, the Russian economy is not going to collapse this year, nor is it going to go into any particularly deep crisis or anything of that kind. Russian GDP has grown significantly in 2024. Inflation is high, but not disastrously high, not by Russian standards. Real living standards have been increasing, and the country is going through an investment boom. You can, of course, impose sanctions on Russian oil and gas, but the Russians will adapt because they will always have customers for their oil and gas. And besides, you're going to inflict significant damage on yourself if you do it. Alongside that very same article by Ambrose Evans Pritchard in the Daily Telegraph, telling us about how, there's no reason to worry if you impose more sanctions because the Russian economy is almost at breaking point. You have another article by another commentator making many of the same points which I have made, which is that this cut-off of gas supplies across Ukraine, the denial to Europe of 5% of its gas, cheap, reliable, steadily supplied gas from Russia passing through the Ukrainian pipelines. How the loss of this gas supply is inevitably, despite assertions made by the European Commission and all sorts of commentators, how inevitably in time it is going to result, over time, it is going to result in higher prices for gas in Europe than would otherwise be the case, and in significantly higher prices for gas now, specifically at this time when gas reserves in Europe are low and when the winter is cold and at a time when inflation is rising and the European economy is under stress. And by the way, the euro is also falling in value, which, to be clear, has a much, much bigger effect on the state of the European economy than the fluctuations of the ruble do on the Russian economy, which is configured completely differently. So, put aside all of this magical thinking. In terms of the military supplies to Ukraine, I had a program about a week ago with Daniel Davis, in which we were discussing the latest arms packages that the Biden administration has signed off for to Ukraine. You could argue it's about $2.5 billion, though around half of that money goes to the US arms industry for future production of future weapons for Ukraine. But, as Daniel Davis correctly pointed out, the United States has already supplied 171, whatever it is, billions of dollars of military aid to Ukraine. What difference is another $2.5 billion of aid going to make? And I discussed in other programs, recent programs, how we now learned that perhaps a quarter of the stockpile of ATACMS missiles was shipped off to Ukraine to achieve minimal and disappointing results. How it turns out that the inventory of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles has been seriously reduced as well. We've also had problems with shells and artillery pieces. The United States has sent very large amounts of artillery pieces to Ukraine and HIMARS rockets and all kinds of things like that. So go on depleting American inventories. go on imposing sanctions, which might cause the Russians some problems, but problems which ultimately they will be able to overcome, but which are going to have long-term inflationary consequences that are going to affect your economy more significantly than it is than the Russians. Well, go on doing all of this to achieve what? What exactly? The Russians are going to win the war. Budanov, Ukrainian military intelligence, has already said so. Why not listen for once to what Ukrainian military intelligence is telling you? You listen to them when they give you what are almost certainly invented figures about Russian casualties. Why always only listen to them when they give you that kind of information? Why not listen instead when they give you this information, which is undoubtedly accurate, it corresponds with the military realities, and it should inform your opinion of what to do. After all, the Ukrainian military knows best of all how bad the situation on the front lines actually is, and maybe if they're ringing alarm bells, one should pay heed to them. Just saying. Well, it remains to be seen what Donald Trump does. I still get the view that he's not made up his mind fully. He's spoken about a meeting with Putin. I think that is an excellent idea. I think the sooner that takes place after the inauguration, the better. I think it's going to require very strong nerves to maintain a negotiation course. But these calls for further escalation, because that is what they are. Tougher sanctions, more arms supplies to Ukraine. What they amount to is more escalation. These calls for further escalation should be resisted. The escalations, the pattern of escalation that we have already seen is precisely what has brought us to this point of crisis in which we are in now. And there is no sense at all in doubling down on it. Anyway, let's discuss something else, which is an article that has been written by Lord Zelensky for the American Conservative. One of the very, very few articles, I should say, which, in my opinion, have shown one of the very few people, in my opinion, who's expressed a level-headed view about the conflict in Ukraine. And, well, Lord Zelensky, for whom I have a huge respect, also as a historian, by the way, makes the point that finally, with the election of the new President of the United States, there is at least a possibility that we can get negotiations. In fact, he seems confident that we will get a ceasefire some point in the spring. I don't share his confidence at all, by the way, but having said that, I don't think this takes away from the underlying merit of what he's saying. But he does something which I'm constantly asked about, which is he asks the question, he tries to take on the question of why is Britain so fixated by Russia to the point that it seems to be constantly pursuing the conflict with Russia, and it's been so aggressive in opposing Russia throughout the period throughout this entire period of the special military operation. The British media, by the way, is off the scale dreadful when it comes to this war. Just to say. Well, Lord Skidelsky does come up with one theory, which I really do want to take some issue with, despite my very great respect for him, which is that he says that part of the explanation is the British government's, the British establishment's abiding sense of guilt for the Munich Agreement of 1938. According to this view, which by the way I've seen expressed in several places, there is a feeling in Britain that Britain made this terrible deal with Germany in November 1938, betraying Czechoslovakia. That is a huge blemish on Britain's record, and of course it failed to achieve its purpose. World War II happened anyway, and the whole thing means that in Britain today we have a huge feeling of hostility to anything that might speak of appeasement. And Lord Skidelsky quite correctly and properly says, as you would expect of a historian, how dreadfully wrong the analogy with Munich, the situation in Ukraine today, is. That this is based on a completely wrong understanding of today's conflict, and by the way, a misreading of history as well. Now, I'd say straightforwardly why I have a problem with this. It is absolutely correct that both the neocons in the United States and many people in Britain, politicians and all kinds of people like that, never cease to bring up the Munich analogy whenever they're looking for some excuse to start a war or to continue a war, as they are currently doing in relation to the conflict in Ukraine. I still don't believe, however, that Munich, the shadow or spectre of Munich, really goes far to explain this. First of all, I'm quite sure that deep within the British establishment, within the Foreign Office and the intelligence services, there's a fair understanding of how the war came about, the real causes of the war, the fact that it has no resemblance to Munich whatsoever, or any of these things. So I think that Lord Skidelsky underestimates the level of understanding within the British establishment of the true causes of the war. The second thing is, and I think this is the key point, what Lord Skidelsky does is he underestimates the abiding dislike, loathing is not too strong a word, that the British establishment has for Russia. Now that existed at the time of the Munich Agreement. It was one of the reasons there was a Munich Agreement. It existed after the Munich Agreement in the negotiations that took place over the course of 1939 between the Soviets and the British in order to try to create a common front against the Germans, negotiations which went nowhere in the end. It existed before that crisis. It existed right through the period of the Cold War. It has existed before the Ukraine crisis. It began to develop basically from the moment when Putin became president. In fact, what we see is a constant in British politics, which appears to be antagonism towards Russia. Of course, this waxes and wanes. There have been times when the British have found themselves in alliance with the Russians, as they did during the Napoleonic Wars, in the First World War, in the Second World War. There's been periods of time when relations between Britain and Russia have seemed to be a lot better. But always, even during those times, you find comments and criticisms and articles appearing from all sorts of people who are completely unreconciled to good relations with the Russians and remain critical of them, and who demand a return to a policy of confrontation. Now, as to why this dislike of Russia, this loathing of Russia exists, I've never been able to provide a fully satisfactory explanation. But that, I believe, is the reason why Britain has taken such a hard line over this conflict. And I believe that this British hard line has had a very negative influence in the United States and in Europe as well. Well, that was a short tangent on history, on historical matters. I accept that it's perhaps of limited interest to people, but, this is my discussion, and I suppose I can bring up these points. I find myself a little in awe of disagreeing with such a figure as Robert Skidelsky, but there it is. It still doesn't detract from the fact that I think that on Ukraine, he has been one of the few voices of reason we have had in Britain. But my main point in this program is that the Ukrainians themselves, or at least Budanov and his people, realized back in April that the war was lost. They communicated that fact to the Americans. The facts on the ground point to it. In fact, they clearly show it. And any negotiation to end the war must be based on that fact. So there it is. That's my program for today. There'll be more from me soon. It looks as if the Biden administration, in its last days, is also thinking about starting a war with Iran. I will probably be discussing that tomorrow. But this is where I end today's program. More from me soon. As I said, let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.